I totally forgot about that. I knew I was going to forget. All right. And I do have the slides ready to roll. So let me put it in screen share mode. And we are going to make the magic happen. Are you guys ready for the magic?
Sure.
Yay. Hi, Horst. Okay, Horst, I assign you the task of you have to ask questions. And by the way, everybody else, I also assign you the task of you have to ask questions. So I'm going to start by asking you all a question. How many people here have ever submitted their own grant proposal as principal investigator, PI, or co-principal investigator, co-PI? Since very few of you are on video right now, just me and Jacob, it appears, then yes, you can raise your hand, or you can yell. Make sure you unmute yourself when you do that. Or you can put it in the chat. See, Bev said hello. So if you've done it before, so it looks like about half a dozen so far. Thank you. And this is out of, what are we? Oh, wow, we're 45. Good gravy. All right. And another few. Okay, so we're something around 15 maybe, give or take. And Ethan, it's totally cool that you haven't. This is not designed to be a very deep thing. It's designed to help us think about how to do a thing. Some of us have submitted proposals like this. Some of us have gotten proposals like this funded. Some of us have submitted other kinds of proposals, but not this kind of proposal. And it looks to me like the bulk of us have not submitted a proposal before, have not been on a grant proposal previously. So I do have sort of in my back pocket, I've got some other materials if we need them, but we're going to focus on this stuff for now, and we're going to see how it plays out. And I reiterate, my job is to get you to say things, either in the chat or with your mouth. You do not have to raise your hand if you want to talk. You can just dive right in. Don't be shy. Okay. So, little quick outline. We're going to spend most of this discussion on the Major Research Instrumentation Program out of the National Science Foundation. So closely related to that we're going to treat them as almost equivalent is the Computing Research Infrastructure Program, the CRI. However, as like any good politician, my strategy is when you ask me a question, instead of answering your question, I will say, that's a great question, but an even more important question is, and then I'll answer the question I want to answer. So in addition to covering MRI and CRI, I will talk about some other programs, especially the Campus Cyber Infrastructure Program, which closely relates to the MRI and CRI programs. Okay. So I'm going to kind of break down what you would see in a proposal like this. What's the machine and where are you going to put it? What's your idea for this project? Give us a sense of what it is and why the heck would you want to do that? And how do you know that you don't just need it, but you, in some sense, deserve it? What kind of research is going to get the value out of it? So the federal research funding agencies are not in the business of funding your needs. They are in the business of funding, and they're also not in the business of funding equipment. They are in the business of funding amazing, transformative research. If the amazing, transformative research makes a strong case that it needs the equipment, then you can use the funds to buy the equipment. But that's not the business they're in. They're not in the equipment business. They're in the amazing, transformative research business. Everything is about that. Then a description, what is the thing that you're going to buy? What's its impact going to be? How are you going to run the project? And how is the NSF going to make sure it doesn't get stuck with the entire tab? And not just the NSF, whoever the funding agency is. All right, my number one piece of advice for any proposal you're ever going to write your whole life, read the program announcement, read the solicitation. It's chock full of valuable information, including stuff that if you don't do it, you ain't getting the money. If it's not in the proposal, they will treat that As grounds for returning your proposal, they say nicely, without review. That means they threw it in the round file. So read the solicitation and then do what it says. Read and obey. Because if you don't obey, you ain't going to get the money. Or at least it really lowers the probability. I've been on a number of, for legal reasons, I have to carefully say, relevant review panels. You'd be amazed how often the proposal comes in where it's clear they didn't bother to read the solicitation. And it's really sad when that happens. Yes, it's always hard to choose among fantastic proposals, but it's so much nicer to choose among many fantastic proposals than a bunch of really junky ones. Okay. It's good for your equipment proposal to have a statement of what the vision is. It's not, okay, yes, in theory, you could just say, this is the instrument we want to buy, here's the research we're going to use it for, and here's some technical details. In theory, you could do that. In practice, that's not going to capture the imagination of the reviewers. We really want the reviewers to fall in love with your proposal. I was on a review panel not too long ago, and in fact, it was equipment related. On this review panel, I think I ended up reviewing like 7 or 8 proposals. And of those 7 or 8, there were 2 that I just fell in love with, that made my heart skip a beat. And so in the review panel, I stood up for those proposals because I loved them so much. And I'm not going to say what the outcome of all that was, but I advocated as a reviewer for those 2 proposals because to me, they so perfectly embodied both what the program was about and what the NSF should be funding. So I was very excited to have the opportunity to stand up for those proposals. And if you can get your reviewers' hearts pumping, if you can get them to fall in love with your proposal, then they're much more likely to stand up for your proposal when somebody else gets into the business of, as is part of their job as reviewers, of talking about what's terrible about your proposal. Because every proposal's got stuff in it that ain't great. I don't think I've ever read a perfect proposal. I've read some great ones, but never a perfect one. And it's really easy for the discussion to become focused on what's terrible about your proposal, which inevitably there'll be something, and not what's fantastic about your proposal. So give them something that they can latch onto. Another nice sort of psychology trick, if you give the equipment a name, I like to pick names that are catchy, that are somehow specific to the group that this is for in some way. I love coming up with an acronym that can be pronounced like a word, but can, if it's Googled, only your project would ever come up. I love that kind of stuff. So we did, for example, we did the One Oklahoma Friction-Free Network, which is pronounced OFFN, O-F-F-N. But if you Google it, we're the only thing that's likely to come up. Well, I haven't Googled it. So I imagine certainly among networking projects, we're the only one that's likely to come up, right? And if you keep using that name over and over, sorry, somebody had a question? Thought I heard someone. If you keep using that name over and over, it reinforces psychologically that this is somehow real. We human beings get really hung up on names, and so using that is valuable. Justify the project. You're going to justify the heck out of the project in terms of the research that it's going to facilitate, but also justify it in terms of national priorities, things that the funding agency cares about because, for example, some national body or perhaps the funding agency itself said this is important. So, for example, the NSF puts out fairly regularly. They put out these reports saying such and so thing is super duper important. And, you know, they do like 60 pages of why it's important and how it's important and all the details and so on. And if you can quote from one of those reports and say, hey, you yourself said in the SIF 21 report, you yourself said blah, 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 and you quote them, right? That's very compelling in my experience, both as someone writing a proposal and as a reviewer, to say, oh, yes, this, or if one of the national academies, like the National Academy of Science, National Academy of Engineering, whoever, if they say it's important. Groups like that, some government.
In Camillus, just wanted to let you know that Thursday works for me. I apologize not to
Okay, I'm going to real quick do a mute. Hang on. But anyway, it can be helpful to give some information about what would be the downside of this proposal not being funded. What's the opportunity cost, for example? That can be really valuable to know. But you got to be careful with that. You should never, in my experience, you should never argue from weakness. You should only argue from strength. You know, I've read proposals where they say, well, we have a really small cluster and it's old and we need a new one, please save us. And I got to tell you, as a reviewer, that's not compelling. What's compelling is, we have this amazing idea for all this research we're going to do, and it's going to be so incredible, blah, blah, blah. That's much more compelling. An argument from strength is always going to be more compelling than an argument from weakness. Okay. Give a quick précis of the research projects that you're going to be talking about. This kind of primes people to get ready. You know, it's the tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them kind of thing. I usually don't have room to tell them what I told them, but at least tell them what you're going to tell them. Give a quick précis of what the equipment is, so they have some context. I have occasionally reviewed a proposal where I read the project summary, that's the one-page thing. I read the project description, that's typically 15 pages. And at the end of that, I still could not tell you what the proposal is about. And that's a really bad sign. So especially if things are somewhat complicated and you're not sure where to start with a very simple, like a paragraph that describes the basic ideas, and then start digging into specifically what you want. Okay, and then Dana says, I like to read the budget first. Yeah, some do. I know there are people who say when they review, oh, I only read the project summary and the budget, or the project summary and the budget justification. And there are people who are very effective reviewers that way. I will tell you that that's not how I do reviews, but different people approach this in different ways, and they all can be quite effective. So making sure that that project summary is really compelling is also very valuable. I'm very much in favor of, and the MRI program announcement, I think, tends to favor this as well, providing a table that summarizes the research projects they're going to be using the equipment. And so what they're looking for, so the columns I like to have, some very brief name of the project, maybe that's like 2 words, right? And then the name of the principal investigator. So how much of the resource they're going to be consuming, whether it's core hours on a cluster or terabytes on a storage resource or gigabits per second on a network, whatever it may be. Some sense of what they're going to be consuming, how much money they've got. So I typically break that down by current versus pending plus planned. Planned covers a lot of sins. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the head counts, and I break that down by faculty, staff, postdocs, grad students, and undergrads. And the idea is mostly, I mean, the reviewer is not going to read the whole thing, but they're going to get a general sense of, wow, this table is crowded with good stuff, which is really the impression you want. They're going to learn more about the research as they dig deeper into the proposal, but this will give them, it'll prime the pump with them. Oh, it's a lot of good stuff. It's going to keep the machine full, so it's going to be a good use of NSF money or whoever the funding agency is. And it is fine if your proposal doesn't have a unifying science theme. Many cyber infrastructure proposals do not, but I have had reviewers, in fact, one time I had a reviewer say, I was going to ding you for not having a shared science theme, but then you pointed out that there's been lots of these grants given to other projects that don't have that, so I decided not to ding you for that, which was a really good reinforcement. That's a good way to win that argument. And please, anytime, dive in here and ask questions or make comments. Don't be shy. You don't need to raise your hand. Just dive on in. You can unmute yourself. It's just a click of a button. Okay, the research projects. Oh, and I got some chats. Okay. What about the project size? Is bigger always better? Not necessarily. This is a very complicated thing. So on an MRI proposal last year, one of the reviewer complaints was, and this was revealed by listing at least those 2 projects at the beginning, well, it looks like half your resources consumed by 2 projects, which was true. And by listing them right at the top of the table, which I had done, I accidentally telegraphed that information to a reviewer who wanted to see a more even distribution of the consumption of that resource. So it's not necessarily the case that bigger is better. You have to find the right mix that's going to capture the benefit to the NSF. Right. Which is better if you're a first-time PI. So the first time I did this, which was all the way back in 2003, I honestly don't remember what, I probably put the biggest one first, but nobody fussed about that. They fussed about completely different things. So if it looks wildly out of balance, then randomize the order sum. If it looks reasonably balanced, put the most important ones first. And again, biggest is not necessarily most important. So if you've got a project that's going to consume a middling amount of resources, but has a ton of money, that might be compelling to put near the top, or even at the top. Or it's a super famous person, or even better, they have a Nobel Prize, right? If you happen, I do not have a Nobel Prize winner at my institution that I'm aware of, but perhaps you do. Those can be wonderful things to focus on. You might want to put the first several in a way that captures the breadth of the community that you are serving. So for example, if your community is a mix of physical sciences and engineering and biosciences and social sciences, all these different areas, well, you might beautifully capture that by having those as the first several projects, both that you list in that table and then that you list in the research section. That's a perfectly good way to do that. I think that's a great question. How important is it for your institution or organization to honor commitment to continue funding post-award? I assume this is primarily in reference to the operations labor. If you want to be believed on the next one, you better follow up on this one, because they're going to judge you when you submit the proposal for the next one. They're going to judge you. If you've stopped doing the thing you committed to last time, they're going to go, well, last time you were going to do that and you didn't, so why would we believe you this time? And you can use this internally at your institution. And I know a number of people have done that, including myself, where you say, you know, we have to commit up front in this proposal, we have to commit to what we're going to do about this after the grant period ends. We have to say that in the proposal. So we need a letter of commitment that corroborates that this is actually what's going to happen, and it has to be signed by the appropriate authority at the institution, which might be your VP for research, your CIO, whoever that might be. And so if nothing else, at least you've got a written commitment from them. But then if there starts to be rumblings as you wind down, you can remind them, A, you committed in writing to do it, and B, if we back out of it now, they're never going to believe us again, right? So we won't get the next grant. Those are usually fairly compelling arguments. I'm not saying that works everywhere all the time, but in most cases, those arguments win the day. Okay. And sorry, your questions are really great and they're moving fast, so hang on. Need to assert where the equipment is going. Yes, in the MRI program, you have to put basically the first line of the project description is where you're going to put the thing. Okay. And that statement needs to be backed up with one of those letters of commitment saying, yes, it's going to be located at such and so location, right? Later on in the proposal, you can describe what that space is like and how much of that is currently available and how much of it is committed to your project and so on. How do you review a proposal? That's a great question. I tend to read from front to back with some skipping around as things occur to me. So, you know, I'll be in the middle of reading it. I'll go, you know what, I want to look at the quotes now. And I'll go look at the quotes. Or I'll be reading it. I'll be in the middle of reading the project description. I'll go, you know, I really need to take a look for a second at the budget justification. I'll jump around as ideas occur to me. But my sort of, call it my base path, is more or less linear from beginning to end. But again, everybody does it differently. What I do try to do is, as I'm reading through, I am always typing comments that are going to be sent to the PIs. I'm typing comments into the place where they get sent to the PIs, and I'm repeatedly saving that so I don't lose the stuff, because I have very poor short-term memory, and if I don't write it down or shout it out the minute it comes into my brain, it's just gone. So I can't wait around. So I have a window open that's where I'm typing my comments as I read, because, you know, I get another paragraph in and I've forgotten even where it was that I had a comment, let alone what the comment was. So everybody does it different. I provide a lot of detailed feedback. And one of the things that the program officers taught me to do, and I think a lot of us have had this experience, is you don't say this proposal sucks because, you say this proposal would be strengthened by, which covers the same material but is not soul crushing, because the goal is not to crush their soul. The goal is to get them to write a better proposal next time. And so even when a proposal is just the worst thing I've ever read in my life, and you know, you get those from time to time, I still will try and couch things in as positive a way as I can, because better they should come back next time and do a good job. Yeah, Dana's right. We could spend a lot of time talking about reviewing. For non-historical... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So, this is John Towns. I just wanted to chime in on a couple of things, Henry. I think you made some excellent comments, but one of the things that I wanted to comment on that has both to do with how you review and how you write your proposals is that, and this is something of a meta comment, there needs to be a story, a narrative that goes with what you're trying to propose. It will engage the reviewer much better if they feel like they're reading a story than if they feel like they're reading a technical specification manual, which a lot of proposals sound and feel like. I've reviewed a lot of them myself, and I do a lot of the same things that Henry does. But I find that if I'm jumping around their document a lot, that's distracting to actually understanding what they're proposing. And so you should make it easier for them to go simply linearly through it, because you control how you present the information to them, but it has to hang together in the right way. They can't be prompted to jump somewhere else in the document for something. You should really make it much more of a narrative. So you're telling a story. You have to keep this in your mind when you're writing the proposal, and particularly later in the process, when you're bringing all the parts together that may have been written by several people who have different styles. It's one of these things that fit into the category of neatness counts, and it's actually pretty important. It's very subtle. It isn't really evident on the reader what's going on, but you want to control how they read the documents, so you control how they digest what you're giving them. And having a narrative around that can really assist in that a lot.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I will say that my own way of reviewing, because I have the short-term memory problem, I'm going to be inevitably jumping around anyway. That does not prevent me from following the narrative. And the other thing that I would add, one of the things that I as a reviewer appreciate seeing is I'm not going to go follow a reference to another part of the proposal. If it says see section 12, I'm not going to go there. But I do appreciate knowing that section 3 somehow does relate to section 12 and vice versa. I like knowing that the pieces actually are relevant to one another, and it's not just a bunch of disparate chunks. And this, I think, goes back to John's point about it's real easy to write a proposal that's obviously 6 different things written by 6 different people, or 12 different people. Okay. Where was I? Would making cycles available to Open Science Grid be good to mention and do? Absolutely, yes. We are going to be contributing part of this back to the community. That's going to be very well received. And participating in a well-known national program for giving back to the community is a very easy way to convey the information we consider ourselves to be participating and be embedded within this national community. So absolutely, that's a fantastic thing. Okay, skipping around.
I echo that, Henry, that it's almost essential nowadays to do that. And it could be either to a regional, it can be to local institutions near you, it could be to Exceed, it could be to OSG, but reviewers want to see that.
Yes. Yeah, and in fact, I think increasingly the program officers are becoming insistent on this. For example, for MRIs for cyber infrastructure, they are dissatisfied and they're not as compelled in terms of the value they're getting for the money if all of the resources are going to a single institution. I don't want to say that today they're getting offended by that. I think that's going too far. I will say that the direction things are trending, it wouldn't surprise me if not too many years from now, they would get a little offended by that, by all of the resources going to a single institution. Okay.
And I want to underscore that. So in the case of Exceed, we have 2 MRI awardees who are allocating part of their system through our process. And I know in both of those cases, they were important factors in them winning the award.
Yeah,
and,
I think
they had that in their comments. And
I want to append something to that because I think you've raised a really important point. I think I'm right that in both of those cases, the award amount was above $1 million. And in the MRI program, there's under $1 million and there's over $1 million. And under $1 million, I'm making up this number, but it's probably roughly correct. Your probability of success is 3 times higher at under $1 million than at over $1 million. If you want to be successful, and the reason for that is for over $1 million, there's a second round of reviews called the Technical Oversight Committee, which is actually a committee made up of representatives from the various NSF directorates. So the Bioscience Directorate, the Math and Physical Sciences Directorate, the Engineering Directorate, Geosciences, et cetera. And that process, because there's a very limited pool of funds available for projects that are above $1 million, that process is much more brutal. And so you can help if you're going to go over $1 million, I'm not going to say there's an absolute obligation. That's clearly not true, but it will really strengthen your proposal to say, we're going to be making part of this resource available to the community. Okay, research.
Yeah, and I think that's
sorry, go ahead, John.
I just wanted to say that point there is really important in that particular review, because at this level of investment, they want to see broad use of the resource.
Yes.
And because they're trying to, as you said, maximize their investment. I would suggest that those who are submitting proposals of this type get a letter of collaboration with whomever they're going to be sharing that resource with, so that's known up front. And if there's any issues with sharing through their mechanisms, you've addressed them in your proposal. And so if you were, I'll use the Exceed example because it's easiest for me. If you were going to propose an MRI at $3 million and you wanted to share, say, 20% of the resource with the broad community and allocate it through the Exceed allocations process, having a conversation up front that you can say, we have talked to the folks at Exceed, we understand how we integrate as a service provider in their framework, and we're ready to do those things, and point to the documents of what you need to do so it's clear that you understand you've done your homework. It's a lot more compelling than just to say, well, we're going to talk to the Exceed folks and we'll allocate it through that. So do your homework on these sorts of things, because they'll pick up on that pretty quickly.
And I would say, in my experience, there are 3 ways to prove that you genuinely have somebody on board your project. One of them is what John just said, which is to have a letter of collaboration. Now, I'll say with the MRI program, that can be very tricky because the letter of collaboration you can get is a form letter, and it says nothing about what's actually going on. It just says, see the project description. The second way you can do it is to make them a participant on the project. that is, make them senior personnel, or even if it's justified, make them co-PI. The third way to do it is to have them on some kind of external advisory committee. All three of these, in my experience, are interpreted by reviewers as endorsement of the project by that individual or organization, without having to have a letter of endorsement, which the NSF now officially hates. Okay. Must a research project already be funded in order to be included in the proposal? So technically, no. What will happen in my experience is the reviewers will look at the totality of the list of projects and the balance of that. So if you have a few projects on there that have no current funding, that's probably not a crisis. If the bulk of the projects have no funding, that probably is a crisis. And if the biggest consumers of the resource have no funding, that probably is a crisis. So it's fine to have some. It's a bad idea to have the bulk of it. And the reason for that is, if a project has no funding, then the reviewers believe it is lower probability that the project will actually move forward, that it'll be able to be successful. Because if you've got no money, you're not hiring any students, and you're not going to be in a position to, generate the data or do the runs or whatever it may be that you are claiming you expect to do. Okay, these are such good questions. A single voice is also important so that it does not look like a mashup of ideas. Yeah, it is a very good point that how you express yourself should be consistent across the proposal if at all possible. Okay, and Dana already answered some of that too. Already to OSG. Do resources from an MRI allocated to exceed count as cost sharing? No. And the reason for that is the resources from the MRI were paid for by the MRI grant, presumably. And so they were paid for by federal funds, and cost share can only be paid out of non-federal funds to avoid exactly that sort of trick. Okay. So I'll close those out for now, but those are fantastic questions. I'm really delighted by that. Okay. So I think we got most of this stuff covered. It is good to give the bulk of the real estate to the projects that are the most compelling. And most compelling, again, is not necessarily the biggest consumer of the resource, not necessarily the one with the most money. It's a balance of these features, and it could be some other factor that's really super exciting, right? This is a project that led to this major prize or whatever, right? This project won the X Prize because we're doing a simulation of shooting rockets off to space, right? Things along these lines. And bye-bye to those who had dropped out. Okay, so anyway, questions that you want to ask the research projects, or rather questions that the reviewers will want answered. How much funding does the research have? And that's broken down. I like to break down by current, pending, and planned. And as I said, planned covers a multitude of sins, right? This is because planned is ill-defined. Current is obvious, right? Grants that are active. Pending is obvious. Grants that have proposals that have been submitted and are currently under review. Planned is very nebulous. And I will tell you that my experience with researchers is many of them have great difficulty coming to some kind of concrete single dollar figure for what they're planning to do over the next few years. It's very, very difficult for a lot of researchers to do that. I ask them to take a best guess, and probably better than half the time the answer is, I really just don't know, I'm writing zero. And I'm not going to tell them to lie. They should come up with the best numbers they can, and if they don't feel like they can come up with a number, that's fine. And they should also say where the money is coming from, right? Is it NSF? Is it Department of Energy? Is it NASA? Wherever the money, NIH, whatever the source of the money is. The reviewers like to know this. How many people are on your team are going to use the equipment? Faculty, staff, postdocs, grad students, undergrads. And that's projected out over the lifetime of the equipment. And by the way, the lifetime of the equipment, hopefully, is longer than the lifetime of the grant. The grant typically is going to be something like 3 years. Maybe you take a no-cost extension, you go to 4 years or whatever. But the equipment, depending on what kind it is, it could last significantly. Like if it's a network system or something, it could last significantly longer than that. So it's better to couch these things in terms of the life of the instrument, not the life of the grant. Okay. Then for each of these projects, you have to say what the intellectual merit is. You have to say what the broader impacts are. And I think the most recent NSF Major Research Instrumentation solicitation said that now you have to explicitly say that. You can't just talk about it. You actually have to have a section that says intellectual merit and a section that says broader impacts. I was already doing that, so that was not a big leap for me. But what makes the research transformational? It's great to do good research. But if the good research you're doing is a little tiny step forward, as much as we all agree on how important that is, that's not as compelling for reviewers as here's why this is transformational. Here's why this is important to my research community or to my state or to the nation or to the world. Here's why this is a big deal. And the more of your research projects that can capture big deal, the better. Okay. Why is this specific equipment needed? Now, if the equipment you're going for is super duper vanilla, right? Just a regular old cluster supercomputer, for example, you don't necessarily have to dig too deep into that. But if you're doing something the least bit off the beaten path, I'm going to have lots and lots of accelerator cards. I'm going to have lots of RAM per core. I'm going to have an unusually high amount of disk for the amount of compute I have. Whatever it may, or I'm going to have super fast disk, right? Whatever is going to be even a little bit non-vanilla, the more of your research projects that can say, we specifically need this capability that makes this equipment unusual, the more of them that can say that, the more compelling it is. Because I've read proposals where one of them needed the super special thing and nobody else did. And none of the reviewers found that compelling. They were like, well, why don't you get a regular cluster for everyone? And then those folks can spend their own grant money on that super special thing. And that is a question you do not want the reviewers discussing. You want the reviewers to already have decided before they get to the review panel face-to-face or on the phone or whatever it is, you want them to already have decided that your ideas of what the instrument should be align well with what the instrument is going to be used for. Okay. And also...
So, Henry, can I comment on that a little bit?
Please.
Yeah, so on this point, I think this is a really important point, even for relatively, because I think what we're mostly talking about is hardware proposals here. Even for relatively simple designs, what I find very helpful is as you talk about the science driver cases that are going to be the primary users of the resource, if as you talk through what their science goals are, you can derive from them requirements that drive the design of the system and tie them together, right? So when you're writing, I usually do the science pieces up front. That's what they want to see. Remember, most of these folks are research faculty, so they care more about the science than the hardware for the most part. So they'll want to see the science story and why are you doing this up front and what is the great science that's going to be accomplished. And as you go through those, maybe at the end of your write-up for each one of them, you say, and the system will require being able to do X, Y, and Z in order to satisfy the needs of this project. And then as you write about the configuration, you can remind them that this particular design was driven by these requirements from these researchers that will be using it. It helps the reviewer connect those things, and it shows that you've done your homework, that you're putting together a system and a design that is responsive to the needs of the researchers that are going to be using it. So I think it's just a helpful thing to do. In some of the larger ones, I've made tables of these things so that they can track how they map back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think part of it too. So let's take the example of a cluster, right? How are you going to say how much of the cluster is going to be needed by this particular project? Well, you need to identify what software they're going to be running. You need to run some benchmarks on as similar a platform as what you're proposing. And if it's significantly different, you need to have some mechanism of extrapolating what you would guess, because it is going to be a guess, and the reviewers understand that, what you would guess would be the performance on this platform you're proposing. And then you need to look at, how many such experiments are they going to run per year, and how much will that grow, and how big will the experiments each individually grow to be? I mean, you can't predict the future. It's the standard Yogi Berra joke, right? The predictions are hard, especially about the future. You can't properly predict the future. You can show that you've thought carefully about these issues and you've gone to the trouble to investigate. So running benchmarks on a similar platform is really compelling for a reviewer, because this rolls back to, if you don't do that, then the reviewer's going to say, well, if they couldn't be bothered to prove it to me when they don't have the money, why would I think they would go to any trouble when they do already have the money? That's the basic logic, right? And this underlies proposals, not just grant proposals. This is like if you do an RFP or whatever, and the bid responses are sort of lackluster. You look at that and you go, well, if they couldn't muster it up for the RFP when they're trying to get the money, well, once they bank our money, why on earth would they go to any trouble then, right? You really have to answer the reviewer's question, why should I believe you? And even more than that, more fundamentally, why should I believe in you? Because in real life, they won't believe you until they believe in you. So getting them to believe in you, oh, this is a go-getter who figures out what needs to be done and makes sure it happens in time to get it into the proposal, that is very compelling, because it's going to eliminate a lot of other questions that a reviewer would ask, like, why would I believe that you're going to do a good job at this, right? Well, if you didn't do a good job with the proposal, I'm going to immediately believe you're not going to do a good job at this. But if you do a great job with the proposal, at least I've seen you do a great job once. Okay.
Yeah, related to that, Henry, is
yeah, please.
We've been dinged before by them saying, oh, you can't possibly deploy that instrument. So you got to clearly demonstrate the ability to engineer, deploy, operate, maintain the resource, that you have the staff and experience necessary to do it, that you have a history that shows that you've done this before, because otherwise they don't trust you.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, and I'll give you a very concrete example of something that we did that I've used again and again and again ever since the building opened in 2012 that our systems are in. I had one of our team go with a tape measure and measure every step of the way from the loading dock to the place we were going to put it in the data center. What is the width and height of every part of that pathway? So that I could say that width varies from such and so to such and so, and that height varies from such and so to such and so, and the equipment we're going to bring in is this wide and this high. And that shows that we know that we can actually get it through the doors. And the reason that I wanted to do that was not that they needed to know those numbers or that we needed to know those numbers. I wanted the reviewers to see that we were going to look at every single part of this process and take it seriously. And we put that in.
Something to that?
Please.
So if it's your first system and you haven't had one before, a good way to make up for not having had that before is, as a campus champion, if you have computational researchers that you've helped use exceed resources, right? Because you want to see those research projects as kind of shovel ready, as I call it. If you see a proposal and the research projects, they've never used a research computing infrastructure before, then you're very skeptical. But if you see that, say, they're a campus champion or something, and they've helped these researchers and know a lot about what they're using, say, exceed resources or OSG, that you're now trying to better their facilities by building your own cluster, that can get you past that first hurdle if you don't already have the experience.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Real quick, so Dane had asked, where do you think the balance is between intellectual merit and broader impacts for MRIs? So I think for most programs, and I think MRI would be included in this, the balance does favor intellectual merit significantly. The MRI program announcement says you have up to 9 pages for the section on the research that's going to use the instrument. And that's 9 out of 15, so that's what, 60% of the proposal real estate. Not that you're required to consume all of it that way, but you have the option to consume up to 60% of the real estate on that. And while there'll be some broader impacts in there, they won't be the bulk of it. The bulk of it will be more focused on the intellectual merit. You will have somewhere in the other 6 pages, most likely, something that you would call a broader impact section that brings focus to the broader impacts of the project as a whole, not necessarily of the individual research projects that are consuming the instrument. But that, now that I've said it that way, it's pretty clear that that balances very strongly in favor of intellectual merit. And it doesn't minimize the broader impacts, but they don't loom as large. That doesn't make them unimportant. They are still super duper important. It's just the reviewers will be perfectly willing to accept a more compact description of the broader impacts compared to a more compact description of the intellectual merit. Okay. All right, we're on like page 4. Okay, so questions that you're asking people, and one of the things you need to be able to say how you calculated how much resources. I talked about the benchmarking thing, but it's really, I mean, you don't necessarily have to have a formula, but you need to. It's helpful to walk the reviewers through. We did this kind of benchmark. It took this long. We know that a real experiment is going to be this much bigger than that, or this many more iterations or whatever. And we know we're going to do 100 of those experiments per year. The lifetime of the machine is this many years. We expect the size of each one to grow by such and so, blah, blah, blah. And you can come up with some reasonable guesstimate. And it is a guesstimate, and the reviewers know that perfectly well. They know that you are working with very limited and wildly inadequate information in order to make your best extrapolation of what the consumption will be by each research project. That is still, to the reviewers, and I say this both as someone who writes proposals and as someone who does reviews, that is still incredibly compelling. You know how to think through. You know how to do your homework. I don't need to see all of the answers you got to the homework. I need to know in a very concrete way that you know how to do the homework and are willing to do the homework, right? It's like when you turn in a big homework packet and it gets a check mark in the grade book. Right? That's not, for you, that maybe is not as valuable because you'd like the feedback on the work you did. But for them, what they got was you knew how to do it and you went to the trouble of doing it. And those are 2 very valuable things in and of themselves. So you can say to each of the researchers that's going to use it, can you give me a 1-page summary of the research that's going to be using this? And that's usually a good jumping off point. Now, depending on how many such research projects you have, that may end up being way too much text. The MRI that I submitted most recently, it started at something like 35 pages. And then we had to cull it down to 15. And the overwhelming majority of the extra 20 pages was the research descriptions, because we started with everybody giving us, it may not have been quite a full page, but a big fraction of a page. And there were a lot of them. So a lot of the labor was actually culling out and cutting it down and trimming and trimming and trimming. And I think it only took me the equivalent of about a business day just clipping things out until it fit in the 15 pages. That was very, very labor intensive. But it's labor that I'm perfectly happy to do, and I'm pretty comfortable doing that. I actually became much more comfortable doing that when I discovered that there was a way to hide text so I could bring it back if I needed it rather than actually deleting it. Okay, I think we've already talked about all of this, so I'm not gonna overdo it. But there is a point way down here, the little green point down here. When you're estimating this stuff, don't overdo it. Don't make things sound bigger than they are, because the reviewers are not going to believe that. If you've inflated the claims or you've erred on the side of being liberal in your estimates, the reviewers are going to think you're either naive or full of BS. They're not going to believe you. So, and you never, ever want to convince the reviewers that they can't trust what you say. That is a bad idea, right? Okay, suppose it's for some kind of new stuff. You know, it's the V100s from NVIDIA, or it's the Knights Landing from Intel, or it's some FPGA that you're going to do. Why should they believe that the research projects that are in your proposal can use that platform? Well, you got to show them that that code has been ported to that platform, or if it hasn't been, that there's a plan for getting it there. And this is something you have to be careful about, because a lot of your users are using community codes, or in some cases commercial codes. They're not writing their own software. Some of them are, but in my experience, the bulk of them are not. And so if you're going to claim that the software will be ported to that platform, you need to have something in writing that demonstrates that that's true. And by the way, my experience has been a reference to a personal communication from, you know, somebody on the software development team for that package is probably going to be sufficiently compelling. But if you've got nothing except your wild, unsubstantiated claim that that code is going to get ported to Knights Landing, or a particular flavor of FPGA, that is not compelling. Your wild, unsubstantiated claim is not going to sway the day. You need something that is concrete, that says why you believe that's true. Okay. Blah, 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 that sort of thing. And of course, if it hasn't been ported, how do you know that you're going to get a particular speed up if it hasn't been ported? How are you guesstimating that? For example, are you looking at similar codes that got such and so amount of speed up, so you figure, well, you know, I'm going to be conservative and say we'll do half as well, or whatever. These sorts of, again, show that you know how to do the homework and you're willing to do the homework, that you've busted your hump to make this the best proposal possible. Okay, if it's a storage proposal, or if it's a cluster proposal where there's a certain amount of storage, how much is needed? How are you going to manage that? The easiest thing in the world, if you've got a big pile of disk, the easiest thing in the world is to fill it up, right? So how are you going to manage that? Do you already have a history of running clusters at your institution, and you know what the usage pattern is? Okay, so talk about that. What has been the pattern up till now at your institution? And what would you project based on the fact that this new system will be however many times bigger or faster, or what have you? If you're going to run out, how do you deal with that, right? Are you going to do automatic purging of scratch systems, and so on and so forth? I mean, there's a lot of questions that come up. And by the way, noticing that we're down to 7 minutes, I'm just going to drone on until we come to the end of the hour. And if people want me to keep droning on after that and they want to stick around, I can keep droning on for a little while after that. I do have a call set up at roughly 4. It can be a little late. It's not the end of the world. Okay. If it's a campus cyber infrastructure grant, what's the expected typical size of a data set that you're transferring? And that includes, take into account the growth rate over time. So for example, most researchers, they don't pick a problem size and then stay there for 10 years. I'm sure that does happen, but it's not common. The common thing is they pick a problem size today, and then a year from now it's gone up a bit, and another year from now it's gone up more. And, you know, so I tell the researchers, okay, so figure out where you are now, and then we'll think about whatever that number of years is. And, you know, is it going to double every year, every other year, every 4 years? Will it double over 8 years? What, you know, how long will it take to double in size? And some of them can take a reasonable guess at that, and other ones will just default to, well, Moore's law is 2 years, so we'll just assume it's 2 years, right? And that's not unreasonable. And so you can then, based on that, you can calculate, well, over the lifetime of this thing, understanding the growth rate, this is why I think we're going to get to such and so point by the end of the life of this thing. And you can show how that was calculated. And that's very compelling. Again, that you know how to do the homework and that you're willing to do the homework, that you've busted your hump to do it. Okay. for networking stuff, where the data is coming from, where are they going to? Why do they need to move between those endpoints? That is, what's the science or the research value of getting the data from my institution to NCSA? What's the importance of that? Why does that matter? If I don't do it, if the data doesn't move, is that the end of the world? Why? Okay. And how much time do you have to move that data, right? So is it that your grad students are going to get bored because they don't want to sit around that long? Or is it that it's weather data, and if it doesn't get to the other place quickly enough, people will die, right? These are really good questions. And it's not that you can't have some of both. Not only you can, but almost inevitably, you will at least have the category of, it's not the end of the world, it's just going to be, it's really going to slow down the progress of research. That is a compelling argument. Going to lose lives and property, obviously even more compelling, right? How often do you do it, right? If it's a thing that it's not the end of the world if it takes a while, and you only do it once a month, that's a much tougher argument in favor of spending a lot of money on equipment to move it rapidly. Okay, results from prior NSF support. Every NSF proposal is required to have this section. At least I've never heard of a program where that was not required. If you've got lots of it, you're not going to have enough real estate to put it all in. You know, they say in theory you can have, I don't know how many, 5 pages or something of this. I've never seen a proposal that had 5 pages. I've never seen a proposal that had more than about a page, maybe a page and a half of results from prior NSF support. And the grant proposal guide says, pick the project per PI and per co-PI that is most relevant. So one project for the PI, one project for each of the co-PIs that is most relevant to this project. But here's the thing. If you play your cards right, you can turn this section into some more narrative to support the points that you're trying to make. So you don't have to be constrained to that if you've got other story that you can incorporate into this. So on one of the proposals we wrote, part of the story was this networking project is part of a history of networking and other cyber infrastructure projects that have been happening in our state among most of these collaborators for, at that point, it's like 10, 12 years. And so we have this overall arc of progress using research cyber infrastructure in these several different research projects. But now, so we have all these projects that have been involved in these things at one point or another and have continued to be involved. And now we also have a few new projects. So we both have a steady base that we've been building on top of, and we have growth. And that all of that was encapsulated in the results from prior NSF support. And I found that to be compelling, and the reviewer feedback suggested that as well, that was very compelling. All right, and I know I'm almost, I'm down to half a minute. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Right, equipment description. So describe what it is, and you can put a lot of detail in a paragraph or two. You don't have to consume an enormous amount of page real estate describing the instrument. And plus, the really detailed stuff is going to show up in your quotes anyway, which are supplementary documents that you include in the proposal. But you can describe it in enough detail that it's compelling, and my experience on cyber infrastructure equipment proposals is that the reviewers are a mix of researchers who use that kind of cyber infrastructure and cyber infrastructure professionals who provide in some way, at least some kinds, not necessarily the same kind, but some kinds of cyber infrastructure. And the cyber infrastructure people, it'll be very compelling, and they read through and they understand what you're getting at. The researchers don't necessarily understand all the details, but it sounds like you know what you're talking about. And when they go into the review panel, the cyber infrastructure people say, oh yeah, that person totally knew what they were talking about. And so they're satisfied as a general rule. Okay. It's very helpful. My experience is it's helpful to say, we're going to do a standard RFP process just like our institution does all the time. And if this is your first time through, we're going to work with our purchasing organization. We've already talked to them, and they're happy to help us work through the process, and we also have identified these people who know how to do this already, and there's ways to capture this. We've got people to lean on, or we've got an external advisory committee who's going to help us figure out some of this stuff, right? These sorts of things are pretty compelling in my experience. If there's similar equipment at your institution or otherwise available to people, be upfront about that and explain why that's not adequate for what your researchers need. There's not enough capacity, your people are low priority, whatever it may be, right? Just because there's a similar thing nearby doesn't mean the answer is no. Just because there's a similar thing at the national level doesn't mean the answer is no. If the entire national need could be covered by the national centers, then there wouldn't be a need for us campus champions, and none of us would be in this business. The fact that almost every doctoral granting institution in the country and several of the non-doctoral granting institutions are pursuing this kind of stuff, to my mind, is sort of proof by contradiction. If it wasn't needed, we wouldn't be spending all this time and energy and money on it, so it must be needed. And in my experience, just because there's a national resource that looks similar, that is not a reason to not submit your proposal. Okay. And again, I'm going a little over. You're welcome to stay. You're welcome to leave if you have other commitments. I've already said most of this. I describe how it's going to be delivered, installed, and how you're going to train the person responsible for it to run the thing. If it's a cluster, I think for operations training, you can say, oh, we're going to take the Linux Clusters Institute workshops, right? And we're going to commit, $5,000 worth of travel funds and registration fees to go to those workshops. And that's incredibly compelling, right? Or if you're buying some kind of storage system, oh, the vendor has a training program, it's $3,000, and we're committed to paying for that, right? Whatever it may be. Talk about the expected performance, right? And for most kinds of cyber infrastructure, either you can estimate that pretty straightforwardly, and if you're not sure how, you can ask the community and people can give you really good feedback. Or if it's a proprietary thing, usually the vendor can give you a reasonable estimate. Okay. Impact. How is the equipment going to attract researchers? I think many of us participate in faculty recruitment, where we get a call from a department saying, hey, I've got such and so person coming next Wednesday. By the way, I have one of those literally tomorrow night. I have a dinner for that. We've got so and so coming next Wednesday. Are you available? Here's the time slots we have open. Are you available to come and talk to them about the stuff that's here? Well, that is a huge thing for example, new faculty. It even can affect student recruitment. And what you can do is you can point that out in the proposal. Then when you're talking about the impact on research, that's trivial. You just refer back to the research section. Okay, broader impacts. There's a lot of different areas of broader impacts. You don't have to do all of them. You have to make a compelling case that there's a substantial set of broader impacts associated with your project. And the categories they have, some of them are really easy, right? Integration of research and education. Well, these folks are going to be using this for the research, and this subset of our researchers have said that they're going to use this in courses they teach, right? That's really easy. Underrepresented populations. So one of the things that we've done in our MRI proposals is we ask all of the researchers, for your current team, how many of each of the standard categories of underrepresented populations do you have on your current team? Then we add all those up and we say, this is what we've got now. So this shows that we have had some success already in recruiting people from various target populations. And that runs the gamut from, on the one hand, women, on the other hand, U.S. veterans. There's a bunch of these different populations, right? How are you going to attract these populations? Well, we have a track record. One of the things my experience has been with broader impacts is, for broader impacts, you are judged much more on what you've already done successfully or failed at than on what you say you're going to do. And in my experience, the reason for that is anybody can say, oh yeah, we're totally going to do some kind of, we're going to support some courses that are you. Anybody can say that. Anybody can say we're going to recruit people from the following target populations. Anybody can say that. But it's like that quote from, I think it's Shakespeare, you know, I can call monsters from the vasty deep. I, and so can I, and so can anyone, but will they come when you call them, right? So it's less compelling for the broader impacts to make claims about what you're going to do. It's more compelling to say what you have done, what your track record is. Okay. Management plan. It's good to talk about the facility. I have, it's on the order of a page worth of text, and it breaks it down. Like, I talk about floor space, power, cooling, and for each of the, well, particularly for the floor space, how much is total, how much is already consumed, how much has been committed to this project. The same thing with power. Cooling is a little more nebulous. I talk about things like fire suppression. I mentioned the one about the path from the loading dock to where it's going, the network. There's a bunch of these categories, right? Again, they want to see that you've done your homework. There was a case, it's probably a decade ago, thereabouts, where there was an MRI that was awarded to a particular institution, and it was not awarded to the Central Cyber Infrastructure Organization, if I remember correctly. It was awarded to a particular consortium of faculty members, and they didn't have expertise with this kind of equipment. And it turned out that the available power in the data center that they had a commitment for was half of what they needed. So they bought the equipment, they got it into the space, and then they could only turn half of it on. And I think eventually they got that resolved, and they got more mechanicals in there, and things worked out. But they hadn't done their homework. And so reviewers are much more vigilant now. They want to know that you've done that homework. The labor, who's going to be responsible for being the sysadmin or whatever it is, who's going to be in charge of the care and feeding of that machine? Whose job is that? And do they know how to do it? How can the reviewer know that they know how to do it? What's your read on the appetite for MRI cluster proposals these days? I think there's a pretty good appetite for cluster proposals. I think there's a much weaker appetite for anything cyber infrastructure that isn't a cluster. And this is, I think, a general principle with the MRI program. It's much harder to get something funded if it's not vanilla. I sort of think of the canonical archetype of what instrument they want to fund as like a confocal microscope, right? And anything the less something looks like a confocal microscope, the harder it is for reviewers to wrap their brains around it. And so it lowers your probability of success, right? Apportioning, who gets how much, right? How do you decide that? It's really good to have a plan in advance, either by percentage or here's how we're going to do it. Or heck, you can say, oh, well, we just have a batch scheduler and people go in first come, first serve, right? I don't mean in the literal sense, it's more fair share, but people just submit their jobs, right? And that's how we've always done it, and it works great here, right? As a reviewer, I would find that's how we've always done it, and it works great here. Pretty compelling, unless that looked like a terrible idea to me based on my own experience. How is the decisions going to be made? So we say, well, we've been using the email vote approach for, since we started in 2002, and in that whole time, we've only had one motion get voted down. So we're pretty good at establishing consensus before we take a vote. And I've never had a problem from reviewers on that. They like that approach. I'm a huge believer in advisory committees. I think reviewers find that very compelling. So you can have it can be as simple as 3 people from other institutions, one who's a cyber infrastructure person, one who's a researcher that consumes that kind of cyber infrastructure, and one who's a broader impacts person. Reviewers love that. I like having an internal advisory committee, people who have some kind of expertise that are inside the institution. I clearly label that as separate from the external one because they don't want that your entire advisory committee is just people at your own institution. That's not compelling. They want timeline and milestones, and they want a sustainability plan. What happens when the grant funds run out? And in the MRI program in particular, there are 2 letters. There's a cost share letter, there's an operations letter. They're both constrained to a single page, and they have to cover everything that your institution's going to commit to. And I do a magic trick with that works pretty well. I have a 3rd letter. And my third letter is what I call the everything letter. It does not go into the proposal because the program specifically forbids letters like my everything letter. But the everything letter is everything that the relevant officers of the institution have committed to in one letter that all of them have signed. And then, even if something didn't make it into the proposal, it's still in that letter, and if there's a question later, I can go back to them and say, okay, here's where you committed to these things that are not actually in the proposal. And it's very compelling at home. Right. Okay. Facility, I already talked about all that, so that's fine. Cost share. Depending on your kind of institution and depending on the program, so taking the MRI program as the example, for the MRI program, if you are a PhD granting institution or a non-degree granting, a non-academic institution, then you have to pay 30% of the total cost, and you have to pay it with non-federal funds. And then the NSF budget will be 70%. So the way you actually calculate that is you figure out what you want from the NSF, then you multiply that by 3/7, and that's what your piece of it is going to be. You've got to have a letter from the appropriate institutional authorities saying how they're going to cover that and committing to doing so with their signature and everything. On letterhead, by the way, all these letters should always be on letterhead with a signature. For some reason, that's very, very compelling. If you're from a non-PhD granting academic institution, then you are forbidden to have any cost share whatsoever, if I remember correctly. And the cost share you have has to be exactly at the level that they say. I mean, to the nearest dollar. There is no such thing as voluntary cost share. You can't do extra. You can't do less. If they didn't ask for it all, you can't have it at all. Right? And if you have any violation of that, that's grounds for returning your proposal without review. Again, which means throwing it in the round file. I don't know what it means to actually return a PDF, but never mind. Okay. This can be hard to get. It depends on your institution. There are institutions where, and my institution used to do this, there are institutions where a particular institutional officer, for example, the VP or VC of research, will just automatically provide the amount of cost share that you need. The whole thing, just in cash, so to speak. And there are institutions where they totally won't do that at all, and they'll give you nothing, and you have to go on your own and beat the bushes to find enough cost share. And that can be very, very difficult to do, and it's important to have a plan for doing that. And if you can't fully execute that by the time it's time to submit, you end up not submitting the proposal, which can be a big, big problem if you're at an institution where there was competition to get that proposal slot, because there's a limited number of MRI proposal slots per year. So that can be a big, big issue. You got to be very sure when you go into this that you have a mechanism for doing the cost share. Okay. For the MRI program especially, and I think this is true for CRI as well, your cost share can be expressed as the labor to deploy and operate the equipment. That's quite common, in fact. And you can leverage that at your institution by saying, if you will commit to hiring me a sysadmin, then that will cover the cost share, and we can run the machine, right? And very often, in my experience, institutions internally will find that very compelling, and they will commit to funding a position in the event that the grant is funded. And then you can say, well, in order for this to be viable, we need a sustainability plan. So how about the sustainability plan would be you don't lay that person off at the end of the grant. And again, this is very compelling. In a number of institutions, people have gotten proposals funded where there's a commitment to continue funding that position essentially indefinitely after the grant has ended. And that's a huge win for the central cyber infrastructure organization at that institution. Now on the other, I got a question here. All right, sticky wicket on the issue of cost share with power costs. Some include, others do not, but reviewers may not consider that voluntary cost share. My understanding is that one of the limitations on cost share is it has to be the case that the cost share could have instead been part of the grant budget. MRI, that's super weird because on the one hand, they do, and on the other hand, they don't allow the NSF funds to be spent on labor. And it's very complicated, and I had to get a written ruling in writing from the lead program officer for the MRI program saying that we were allowed to do cost share as labor because there was some question. So my guess is because you're not allowed to pay for power through the NSF budget, you would also not be allowed to use power as a cost share item. I can't swear that's true, but that sounds true to me. Okay. I'm going to wrap this up because I need to get on to my next call. Oh, there's one more question. Hang on. Solicitation of the MRI has some clearer language on that than it used to. Okay, yes, thank you, Dana. Okay, what's your read on the appetite for MRI cluster proposals these days? Storage service proposals, I didn't think about that. I don't think the MRI program is intended to pay for services. I think it's intended to pay for equipment. So I don't think you're allowed to spend the money on anything that doesn't count as permanent equipment. That's slightly not true, but I think it's largely true. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. I got plenty more slides, but we've had so much great discussion. I'm so excited and delighted by how much discussion we've had about this. I really appreciate everybody participating in this. This has really been fantastic for me, and I hope it's been valuable for you all. And I'm really excited by the upswell of interest within our community in pursuing these kinds of opportunities. Of course, that creates more competition for those of us who are already doing it, but it's the best possible competition, and it's competition I'm excited to have. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your participating in this event today. It's been so much fun, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next event. Dana, any final comments?
Just thank you very much, Henry. This is great. We should probably do it for several more hours.
Yeah.
One of these days.
If I wasn't already having to wet the whistle every 2 seconds. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Henry.
Henry.
Okay, bye.
Take care.